And good evening, everyone, and welcome once again to the Bhagavad-gita Satsang. My name is Hari-kirtana, and I am your host for these weekly gatherings. Thank you very much for choosing to spend your time with me, and let us go through our usual ritual. Please confirm that you can hear me by raising your hand. You have a little icon. Thank you very much. Very good. You can all put your hands down. Thank you. Now that I know that you can hear me. The balance of our housekeeping for those of you who are new to our satsang. You can adjust your audio settings up in the upper right-hand corner. You can also adjust your viewing options. You can view me, but I cannot view you, nor can I hear you. If you have a question, you can type it into the Q&A box. And last week I got a real question that I actually had to think about. Feel free to ask me a real question or a rhetorical question, just to make sure that that Q&A box is operating. We've already established that my favorite fruit is strawberries. Although if I had thought about it a little bit more, I might have said mangoes. Is there a word that rhymes with pavement? There are many words that rhyme with pavement. Pavement, cavement, favement, javement, mavement, let's see, savement, tavement. So many words. All right. Chapter 4, the conclusion was last week. We gave an overview of everything we covered in chapter 4, and we looked at our conclusive or concluding verses, in verses 41 and 42, wherein Krishna tells Arjuna that he should free himself from the reactions to his actions by renouncing action through yoga. Therefore, he should get up and fight. And Arjuna is understandably perplexed, which is where we will meet him as we begin the 5th chapter. Arjuna still does not get it. We will speak of the integration of action and knowledge, renunciation and action together, what the relationship of the two are in greater detail. And we will discuss analysis and practice, by which I mean analytical study, Sankhya philosophy, and action or spiritual action. All right, our other real question: what was it like to live in an ashram for 10 years? Jill, I'm going to accept that as a rhetorical question for now, because it would take far longer than I can allot time for in this class to answer that question and then do everything I hope to do this evening. But if we have time at the end, I will endeavor to answer it. In fact, what I'll try and do is integrate it into our discussion of the relationship between renunciation of action and spiritual action. All right, I will do my best to integrate an answer into our class this evening. We're going to cover verses 1 through 7 in chapter 5. Here's my favorite byline from the New York Times over the last couple of days. I don't know about you, but I read the New York Times as a way to try to understand the Bhagavad-gita. How did we end up here? Trump wonders as the White House soldiers on. Now, the reason this is my favorite headline is because it actually says something that the Bhagavad-gita also speaks about. If you have to ask a question like this, how did we end up here? Then it's an indication that one is bewildered. How did what I was doing result in the circumstances I now find myself in? It's totally perplexing. Action and the reactions to actions are completely bewildering. I was on a panel discussion just a few days ago, and it was about the role of a yoga teacher as a spiritual guide. And the discussion covered things like, well, what do we mean by spiritual? What do we mean by a spiritual guide? Do people actually need spiritual guides? Should anyone really aspire to be a spiritual guide? What should a person look for in a spiritual guide? And one of the things that came up is whether or not someone who is a relatively inexperienced yoga teacher or just a young person has the qualification to be a spiritual guide. And how does one act in that role if one is relatively young? And I spoke a little bit about a book I've mentioned earlier in this class series, Falling Upward by Richard Rohr, where he speaks about the two halves of life. And the recommendation that I made to a young person who's taking the seat of a yoga teacher and is now being looked to to be a spiritual guide to some extent was twofold. One, study traditional yoga wisdom texts, and preferably study with some guidance from someone in whom one has faith that they actually understand the text and can help you. Then next, try to see the world through what you're studying and act in accordance with the instructions that you're receiving. And then age, become older. Because if you have not yet had time to make all the mistakes you are destined to make, or have all the things happen to you that will totally throw your life off the rails, that are destined to happen to you, and you haven't had to move through crises in your life, or you haven't had time to process the trauma that you may have experienced earlier in your life, don't worry. Just wait. All those things will happen. You won't have to do anything different or special. You don't have to go out of your way to find ways to acquire circumstances that will teach you life's lessons. They'll come to you. But if you're not using the first half of your life to look for those life lessons, then in the second half of your life, you end up asking questions like, how did we end up here? So, my recommendation is early on in one's life, one should be engaged in this inquiry as to the nature of action and reaction, and find a way to act from a position of transcendental knowledge. That is to say, take what we hear from texts like the Bhagavad-gita and engage in action according to the directions of such texts. So let's take a look now at Krishna's instructions, following the storyline going all the way back to chapter 2, which is basic knowledge. what we're looking about in chapter 2, what Krishna is describing in chapter 2 after Arjuna asks Krishna to guide him, to be his spiritual guide, is the distinction between spirit and matter, the first lesson, to understand what is the difference between a conscious living being and unconscious matter. Sankhya, the philosophy of discernment or the delineation of elements. Then, how does a conscious living being, a pure spiritual being, become entangled with the material body? Krishna describes the sequence that results in entanglement with matter, and how to disentangle oneself from matter using intelligence, or long-term goal-directed intelligence known as buddhi yoga. And then Krishna describes the symptoms of one who, by virtue of buddhi, or intelligence, spiritually informed intelligence, is moving through the world from a position of detachment and equanimity. So that's just a quick look at what happened in chapter 2. Basic information, laying the groundwork for what's to come. The next thing in chapter 3 is karma yoga, where Krishna describes how one whose actions are informed by transcendental knowledge is no longer obliged to act in any particular way, but is encouraged, he encourages Arjuna to act in such ways to be a good example to others. So one of the advantages of the path of action is that one gets to be of service to others by setting a good example of how to move through the world without being affected by the world, being in the world, but not blown away by one's circumstances, not bewildered, asking oneself, how did I get here? And how am I going to get out of this mess that I've created for myself? And Krishna describes making an offering, making one's actions an offering. And that this is actually what karma yoga is that one makes an offering of one's life, everything one does, to the Supreme Person. So we can call this action yoga, how you connect to the highest truth by performing action as a sacrifice. Then in chapter 4, we start to put these two things together. Knowledge of the purpose of sacrifice is really the liberating element of the sacrifice. So you have to perform the sacrifice. You have to do everything that's involved with the sacrifice. But if you do it without actually understanding its purpose, then you don't get the ultimate fruit of the sacrifice, or the result of the sacrifice, that being transcendental knowledge. So one understands that we undertake to perform sacrifice for the sake of acquiring knowledge, and with that understanding, knowledge appears. Think of it as like fire. The potential for fire is latent in wood. Now, if you know that that potential for fire is within the wood, and you ignite the wood so that the fire comes out, it's the same principle. Sacrifice informed by knowledge results in transcendental knowledge, the same way knowledge of the potential for wood to emanate fire results in the fire emanating. So that's a way to understand it. Now at the end, as I said earlier, Krishna advises Arjuna to fight as an act of sacrifice from a position of perfect knowledge. He's simultaneously stressing the importance of both work in devotion and inaction in knowledge. Remember, Krishna said it's really difficult to understand what is action, what is inaction, what is wrong action, etc. And then he goes on to explain it. But Arjuna still hasn't quite wrapped his head around this. He's thinking that renunciation in knowledge involves the cessation of work, of action. Sannyas, or renunciation in knowledge, should be altogether free from all kinds of activity. This is how Arjuna is thinking about it. Because work and renunciation appear to him to be incompatible. So he doesn't understand that work in full knowledge, in complete knowledge, is non-reactive and is therefore the same as inaction. So that's our starting point as we get into chapter 5, the renunciation of action, the yoga of renunciation of action, or karma sannyas yoga is our chapter title. Okay. I showed you this following the storyline of Arjuna's transformation earlier on in our series. And in the section we're in now, 4 through 9, Arjuna is asking doubt-based questions. In other words, he still doesn't understand, and he still has doubts. Krishna is encouraging Arjuna to slash the doubts that have arisen in his heart with the sword of knowledge. And Arjuna is not quite there yet. And maybe we are also not quite there yet. And if so, we're in good company, because Arjuna is still asking doubt-based questions. Okay, so with that, I am going to read through the verses that we're covering in chapter 5 this evening, and then I will go back to each verse individually and discuss them in detail. So verses 1 through 7 here is chapter 5, verse number 1. Arjuna said, "O Krishna, you are praising both the renunciation of action and spiritual action. Please tell me definitively which one of these two is more beneficial." Verse 5:2. The Supreme Personality of Godhead replied, "Both renunciation of action and spiritual action lead one to the path of liberation. Of the two, however, spiritual action is better than the renunciation of action." Verse 5:3. One who neither hates nor hankers for the fruits of action is known as a renunciate. O mighty armed Arjuna, such a person moves beyond duality, easily overcomes material bondage, and thus attains the joy of liberation. Verse 5:4. Those possessed of a child's intelligence say that spiritual action is different from contemplative study. Those possessing mature intelligence say that by perfect practice of either path, one will achieve the results of both. Verse 5:5. The destination attained by means of contemplative study, as well as by the destination attained by means of contemplative study is attained as well by spiritual action. Therefore, one who sees the unity of contemplative study and spiritual action sees things as they are. Verse 5:6. However, renunciation is difficult to attain if it is uncoupled from spiritual action, whereas the sage who is absorbed in spiritual action quickly attains the supreme destination. Verse 5-7. Having conquered the mind and senses, a purified soul who, by means of spiritual action, remains linked to the Supreme Self within all beings, is never entangled by the actions they perform. So we will look now at each of these verses individually. Do any of you have any questions about what you have heard so far? If so, please go ahead and type something into the Q&A box. I will keep my eyes open for your questions as we go along. So returning to our first verse of the chapter, Arjuna said, "O Krishna, you are praising both the renunciation of action and spiritual action. Please tell me definitively, which one of these two is more beneficial?" So what's interesting to me about this verse is that the answer to Arjuna's question is kind of right there in his question. You have heard me refer earlier in our series to the idea that the secrets of the Bhagavad-gita are secrets hiding in plain sight. And here, the answer to Arjuna's question is in exactly how he phrases his question, because he qualifies action as spiritual action or yoga. The word yoga is used in this verse to indicate karma yoga or spiritual action, action informed by transcendental knowledge. And it is this qualification of action as spiritual action as opposed to material action that makes the action a liberating action. Oftentimes, we don't make that important qualification. What kind of action are we talking about? Because we don't always have a concept of what spiritual action looks like. And certainly due to the influence of different impersonal philosophies or spiritual philosophies that resolve in a unity of being devoid of all features, it seems that in the true state of liberation, action of any kind would be impossible, because action requires individual agency and form, and the thing person, you have to be a person. Things that we may assume disappear in the state of liberation. And we're going to find in the Bhagavad-gita that that is not necessarily the case. That in fact, not only can one act on the spiritual platform while still within a material body, but because to be spiritual means to be eternal, we also can therefore understand that spiritual action is by its nature eternal. This is a real paradox, because action by definition has a beginning, middle, and end. There's a sequence of events evolved in an action. How is it possible that something involving a sequence of events can exist independently of time? That seems impossible. Well, materially, it certainly is impossible. And yet, the implication here is that it is in fact possible on the spiritual platform. I'm going to put this in the category of paradox rather than contradiction. Still, the question really is, which of these two is more beneficial? And Krishna is going to give a pretty nuanced answer in these next few verses. So the next verse, the Supreme Personality of Godhead replied. Now, I've used a different translation from previous classes. Usually I will translate Shri Bhagavan Uvacha as the Blessed Lord said, or the Beloved Lord said. This time I chose the Supreme Personality of Godhead. I was recently asked for my definition of God. I did a workshop on integrating yoga philosophy into classes and workshops up at a beautiful yoga studio in Saratoga Springs, New York, Yoga Mandali. And the answer I gave was an answer designed to make the point that I can't just make up my own definition of a supreme person, nor can anyone else in any real authoritative way. We were speaking about the importance of deferring to a higher authority other than just our own speculation, our own personal truth, and instead focusing on personal realization of an absolute truth. And so when I was asked, what is your definition of the Supreme Being? I said, well, my definition is the same as Patanjali's definition. He gives these qualities of Ishvara as Purusha Vishesha, categorically different kind of person from all other persons. And I was reflecting on this, on the answer that I gave, and I thought, if I had been just a little bit quicker, a little bit more on my toes, I would have offered not just the definition given in the Yoga Sutras, but I also would have given my own definition in terms of my personal realization. And that definition is that person who has all qualities in infinite quantity and absolute perfection. Now that is a paraphrasing of a definition of Bhagavan. Krishna speaks in the Bhagavad-gita, and his speech is preceded by Shri Bhagavan Uvacha. Bhagavan is defined in one scripture, the Srimad Bhagavatam, as the personal form of the Supreme Being. And a more elaborate definition is given by sadhus, great sages, as that person who possesses 6 opulences in full: wealth, strength, knowledge, fame, beauty, and renunciation. And I kind of condensed that into the definition that I just gave you, that person who possesses all qualities in infinite quantity and absolute perfection. So I didn't just make it up, but it still references both yoga wisdom texts and self-realized sages of the past, and the instructions I've received from my own spiritual guide. Therefore, it meets the criteria of checks and balances. And another short way of putting that same definition is the Supreme Personality of Godhead, which is the preferred descriptive by A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada in his Bhagavad-gita as it is. So in the course of putting together this evening's class and looking at the variety of editions of the Bhagavad-gita that I refer to, I saw that and I thought a little bit about my experience in the workshop over the weekend. And I thought, all right, this would be a good opportunity to speak about this. Different editions of the Gita will have different translations of Sri Bhagavan Uvacha. And since I've been using just one or two, I thought tonight would be a good night to throw this one in and explain my reasoning for it. So, Krishna, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, replied, both renunciation of action and spiritual action lead one to the path of liberation. Of the two, however, spiritual action is better than the renunciation of action. So you might wonder, if they both lead to the same place, what makes one better than the other? Is it quicker, easier, faster to engage in spiritual action rather than renunciation? Yeah, actually it is. And here's why. Spiritual action involves renunciation automatically, which is to say, an action that is truly spiritual is an action that does not have any material motive involved. The reason for the action is spiritual. The action, therefore, becomes spiritual by virtue of the reason for performing it. And when one is intent on acting solely for the sake of a spiritual purpose, then automatically material purposes have been renounced. It just comes with the package. By contrast, if you try to renounce material action in a contemplative practice where you turn your back on the world, that's going to be more challenging. And for the most part, most of us aren't going there. We are not going to adopt a monastic lifestyle. It also means that by withdrawing from the world, you don't perform the service of demonstrating to others, leading by example, how one can move through the world in such a way as to not become entangled by the world. It is true that when one renounces the world, one makes a statement. Thomas Merton justified his monastic lifestyle as being a rejection of material values and a refusal to engage with the world on the world's terms, on the assumption that what we mean by that is the material world based on material values and all of the problems that go with that package. And certainly there is a place for that. And Krishna, as we move through this chapter into the 6th chapter, will describe precisely what is involved in the practice of yoga for one who is a renunciate. His recommendation to Arjuna, because the question is, Arjuna is saying, please tell me definitively, which one of these is more beneficial? So certainly for Arjuna, he does not have the temperament of a monk. The path of spiritual action will be better. And if we understand the Gita to be spoken for our benefit, then we can also understand that unless we have the temperament of a monk or a monkette, as the case may be, then the path of spiritual action is going to be more beneficial for us as well. So Krishna continues. One who neither hates nor hankers for the fruits of action is known as a renunciate. O mighty armed Arjuna, such a person moves beyond duality, easily overcomes material bondage, and thus attains the joy of liberation. So this is just the opposite state of being from the New York Times headline I cited earlier. Here, there is no material entanglement, whereas the situation that we see in the news is nothing but entanglement. I mean, it's crazy entanglement. There's no real duality. No, I like this, I don't like this, I hate that, I don't hate this. Whereas the situation we read in the news is that of people who are consumed with duality. This person is bad, that person is good, that person rolled, this person stayed strong, etc. You get the idea. And such a person who is known as a renunciate attains the joy of liberation, whereas anyone involved in the intrigues of Washington's political scene right now is not attaining the joy of liberation. On the contrary, it's precisely the opposite. It is 100% anxiety and stress. So Krishna's advice is don't be like that. Okay. Now he gets into some of the finer details in the next verse. Those possessed of a child's intelligence, he uses the word bala, immature intelligence, say that spiritual action is different from contemplative study. Now this seems contradictory. He just said that spiritual action is better, and that would make it different because it's better. Better is different from not as good. Those possessing mature intelligence say that by perfect practice of either path, one will achieve the results of both. So Krishna here is not discounting the path of renunciation. He's not discounting the Thomas Mertons of the world who turn their back on the world and focus instead on the inner journey, and whose example is one of prioritizing the inner journey. And certainly there is something to be said for that. The more engaged we are with the external world, at least certainly from a material standpoint, then to that extent we dilute the experience of our inner lives. Those possessing mature intelligence say that by perfect practice of either path, one will achieve the results of both. So you can get there from here, whichever way you go. So there's a certain kind of unity here. The destination, the next verse, the destination attained by means of contemplative study is attained as well by means of spiritual action. Therefore, one who sees the unity of contemplative study and spiritual action sees things as they are. So here's a way to understand this unity. By balancing contemplative study with engagement with the world, our engagement with the world becomes spiritualized. Without taking some time in our lives to dedicate to contemplative practices, we will not spiritualize our actions, because we will not have the transcendental knowledge or the realization of that transcendental knowledge that informs our action in such a way so that it becomes spiritual. The two have not a mutually exclusive relationship, which is what Arjuna was thinking at the beginning of this chapter, but rather they have a mutually reinforcing relationship. Leisure time is understood by philosophers as being an essential component of studying philosophy. If you don't have any time in your life to think about the bigger questions, then you'll never get to those bigger questions. If we're always busy doing stuff from the time we get up to the time we crash, when do we get to think about why we're doing what we're doing and whether or not what we're doing is the right thing or whether or not we're doing it the right way? So sometime in one's life has to be dedicated to contemplative study in order to know why to act in a particular way, how to act, and what the results of action will be, which is everything Krishna has covered in the chapters leading up to this one. Why do we act? Because sacrifice results in transcendental knowledge. How do we do it? Well, you approach an expert, someone who has seen the truth in order to get guidance on what is the specific practice or method that's right for you in order to achieve this result. And what is the result? Liberation, the joy of liberation from the entanglement in reactions to actions. Now, here's the caveat in verse 6. However, renunciation is difficult to attain if it is uncoupled from spiritual action, whereas the sage who is absorbed in spiritual action quickly attains the supreme destination. So absorbed in spiritual action doesn't mean that they're just acting. What it means is the absorption is a kind of moving meditation, action meditation. Absorbed in spiritual action means you are absorbed in thought of who the action is for, how the action is performed, why the action is being performed, and what the ultimate goal of the action is. So in other words, action performed in a state of absorption in understanding the nature of relationships on a spiritual level, the nature of the practices that make the action spiritual and the ultimate goal of spiritual action. You put all those things together and you engage in action without deviation from its spiritual intention. Then renunciation of material action happens automatically without further endeavor. Whereas without spiritual action, then one has to endeavor to control an unengaged mind and an unengaged set of senses from the allurements of material action. So by engaging the mind and senses in spiritual action, they become occupied and everything they do is spiritual. Whereas one who is not engaged in action now has a mind and a set of senses that they need to control without acting. Much more difficult. So hence the logic of Krishna's advice that one be absorbed in spiritual activity rather than trying to be a renunciate and engaging in renunciation uncoupled from spiritual action. Okay. And then our last verse is the verse we're going to chant this evening. So we have had our translations and commentary. Here we go. This is our final verse for this evening. I will chant one line at a time. You can chant back. For those of you who are new to transliterated Sanskrit, the accent mark over the S is an SH sound, but from back around your back of your jaw, the bars over the A's are long A's, which means an extended and open ah sound. Dot under the H at the end of a word, at the end of a line, means the vowel before the H echoes back. And I think that covers all of our diacritical marks for this particular verse. Here we go. Yoga yukto vishuddhatma vichittatma jitendriyaha Sarva bhutatma bhutatma kurvanappi na lipyate. I want to draw your attention to Sarva bhutatma bhutatma. This phrase is sometimes interpreted as meaning that one who is linked through yoga is realizing Brahman, and that they are realizing that the self is not different from Brahman. Well, that's one interpretation. We will look at another. The translation again, having conquered the mind and senses, a purified soul who, by means of spiritual action, remains linked to the supreme self within all beings, is never entangled by the actions they perform. So, we have someone who has controlled the mind and senses, someone whose intelligence has been purified by the practice of yoga, and who by the practice of yoga is linked to the supreme self within all beings. Same phrase as we just looked at before, but a different way of understanding it. Such a person is never entangled by the actions they perform. Now, remains linked to the supreme self within all beings indicates that one sees a connection between oneself and all other beings, insofar as we understand that the supreme self who resides within my heart also resides within the heart of all other beings. And therefore, there is a sense of kinship insofar as all beings are related. Krishna will elaborate on this idea later in the chapter. He'll be even more specific about this. And this verse is kind of a seed verse for the verse that will come later. So the idea here is that one in this state feels empathy for all other beings, feels a sense of kinship with all other beings, not just human beings, all purushas, all conscious beings, and therefore treats all other beings like members of the same family. This is very different from the idea of seeing that individual selves are illusory and that actually there is only one self and we are that self. Very, very different concept. Okay. Any questions about any of these verses so far? Please go ahead and type your questions and comments. While I ask for your questions and comments, what was it like to live in an ashram for 10 years? Somebody wants to know. I lived full-time in devotional yoga ashrams for 4 years and 3 years. So it never really totaled up to 10, but who's counting? 7 is close enough. And what was it like? Well, it provided an environment that made it very easy to engage full-time in spiritual action. That was actually the whole point of this particular community, to provide not just an environment, but a spiritual mission that everyone living in the ashram could participate in. We all had the same guru, the same spiritual master that had dedicated himself to the mission of his spiritual master. And so by taking up that same mission of providing spiritual education to others and leading by example, providing people with an example of how one can engage in spiritual action full time, and then of course making sure you actually do that. The ashram served as a vehicle for anyone living in the ashram to learn the techniques of spiritual life, and provided a platform to teach others or share with others these same techniques. And it didn't mean that someone had to live in the ashram to do this, because most of us do not do this. Now, I didn't stay in the ashram. I moved out and then moved back in some years later, and then moved back out again, and I'm not there now. So it was a very good training ground to be completely absorbed 24/7 in this kind of very focused life. I think is a very, very valuable thing. It was certainly a very valuable experience for me. It's not mandatory, it's not necessary. But anyway, that's what it was like. It was an environment that made it easy to have a lot of time dedicated to the contemplative aspect of renunciation, and by virtue of the strength of that contemplative experience, to be able to engage in spiritual action for the entire rest of the day, every day. Whereas sometimes if you're not living in an environment like that, and you have job and family and such like that, it can be a little bit more challenging. That's why I emphasized earlier that it's so important to have some part of your day that's for turning inward, for contemplative, meditative practice, study, etc. And preferably early in the day, so that the whole rest of your day runs on the strength of the spiritual practice, the inner spiritual practice that you engage in before the rest of the world imposes itself on you, or until you are obliged to impose yourself on the world, as the case may be. So I hope that answers your question. And I see no other questions. So I'll assume I'm off the hook. No questions. If, of course, you have questions after the fact, or if you are watching this video at a later date, then naturally I would be very happy to hear from you. Tonight's program, Arjuna still doesn't get it. the integration of action and knowledge, renunciation and action, analysis and practice, how these things all go together, verses 1 through 7. And if you have any further questions or questions later, Hari@Hari-kirtana.com. That's HARI-KIRTANA.com. You still have a little bit of time. We've extended the registration period to August 31st, and we have 2 spots left. So if you are interested in participating in my advanced yoga studies program, the 300-hour yoga teacher training program that I'm doing with Ashley Lateki at Sky House Yoga in Silver Spring, you have until the 31st to enroll. You can go to my website for details. Next week, the art of letting go, being the non-doer of activities, being like a lotus leaf, being in a city with 9 gates. We will cover chapter 5, verses 8 through 13. And that's all, folks. I thank you very, very much for spending this time with me, and I look forward to seeing you all next time. Have a nice night. End meeting for all.